Hey, welcome everybody to my YouTube channel. This is International Master William Paschall. This is Video Chess Training on YouTube. Today we are taking a look at part 2 of my series called Taking Out the Tarrasch. This is Rubinstein's best games against the Tarrasch. One of the greatest players in history, Akiba Rubinstein, one of the greatest players never to become world champion. There's a short list on that. It's probably around 10 players who really were caliber of world championship but didn't quite make it. Rubinstein would be included. The Polish great here, I think, demonstrating very, very strong understanding of actually both sides of the Tarrasch. But for the sake of this video series, playing the white side of the Tarrasch. The Tarrasch defense in the Queen's Gambit normally starts with the moves d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, c5. But as was the case often in Rubinstein's games, he played knight f3 quite frequently. He was a player who was actually quite smart in the practical sense that he did play different setups. Among the setups he played outside of just the Queen's Gambit, I mean, he was also capable of playing e4, particularly early in his career, but primarily he played Queen's Gambit or Queen-Pawn games, including but not limited to the London system, Colley system, Koltanowski with bishop d3 and b3, bishop b2. Queen's Gambit accepted with colors reverse type of positions. So really quite a number of different type of setups. And knight f3 would give him the ability to play either a Queen's Gambit or a closed queen-pawn game, depending. Here we have a game against Capablanca. This was played in 1911. In San Sebastian, a very famous tournament with some of the strongest players in the world. Again, 1911, so this is over 100 years ago. Rubinstein was a player who was far ahead of his time in terms of the opening and understanding modern openings. There are countless variations in chess openings attributed to Akiba Rubinstein. Many openings like the French defense we know very well. But in the Tarrasch, the idea of playing g3, this fianchetto on the king's side, was actually first played, I think, possibly by Carl Schlechter, but Rubinstein really much popularized this idea. After c5, white can play quietly with e3 or d takes c, but we go into a Tarrasch, that's the point here. So it's a Queen's Gambit after the move c4. e6. There are other moves possible. Black can also, of course, play the Queen's Gambit accepted himself by taking on c4. He could do this. Queen's Gambit accepted. Taking on d4. This is normally met by taking on d5 with a kind of symmetrical Queen's Gambit, which should be a little bit better for white. I had an interesting game recently in the variation knight f6, queen takes d4, queen takes d5, knight c3, and my opponent in an online game played queen a5 here. And if you look at the database, it's interesting. I couldn't really find anything that convincing against that move. Look at the database here on Lichess. 20% wins in 5 games. That means black did manage to win a game with queen a5. He rarely ever wins a game in this line. So something interesting just off the beaten track to look at there. But mostly opponents transpose into the normal Tarrasch with e6. That's what we're looking at again. Taking out the Tarrasch part 2. So Rubinstein-Capablanca e6, c takes d, now e takes d, and g3. I would prefer, this would be my preferred move order. I don't see any benefits or necessity in white playing knight to c3 here. And the most common move is g3. According to this Lichess site opening encyclopedia. Now it's possible that a lot of those games are reached by transposition of moves. White could even perhaps reach this position by playing g3 on move 1. So g3 the most common. Knight to c3 is the second most common. The drawback to this, the only real drawback I would think, is that it gives black more options to play setups based on c4. So now we have knight to c6. This is generally considered the right order of moves. Black can also play knight f6, but knight c6 behind the pawns. That normally coordinates best. If knight f6, some players consider bishop g5 to be dangerous. I'm not that sure. If black plays knight f6, bishop g5, very good score for white here. So knight c6, the slightly more accurate move. And now g3. Rubinstein also played a lot of games. We might feature later in the series, taking out the Tarrasch. He played a lot of games based on bishop f4 type setups, bishop g5, as well as e3. So e3 more commonly reached by like semi-Slav type move orders. But he tried pretty much every possible setup till he finally really settled on g3. And now black can play c4. This is an annoying variation. And if you take a look here at the statistics, 25% for black. Average rating 2395. Many more players are playing this. But that's an impressive difference. Like if we look at the statistics here, knight f6, white wins 39%, black wins 17%. c4, white wins 37%, black wins 25%. What's going on there? So c4 is a dangerous line. Black can play for bishop b4, and it's kind of bizarre positions where play is not really as at all similar to the main lines of the Tarrasch. Bishop b4, knight on g to e7, and it's kind of hard for white to find a plan. I mean, it seems like white should play e4, but it's hard to actually achieve e4 for white. So that's a tricky line that black really should consider in this particular move order. And I know some good players, Larry Christensen, for example, playing c4. I think Jan Elvest I've seen play it. But anyway, in those days, it wasn't really considered to be a main line. So Capablanca played bishop e6. This is a very, very unusual move. And I don't know what brought on this move by Capablanca. Capablanca, not a player who really played the... Honestly, he never played the Tarrasch that often. So it was a kind of one-game try here with bishop e6. It's a very strange move. I mean, normally this bishop waits, and it's maybe the last minor piece to be developed. So here, this is a strange move, bishop e6. Bishop not particularly well placed on e6. It's hemmed in by its own pawns at f7 and d5. But it does secure the d5 pawn. It's not that bad, but it would be better to play the normal move, knight to f6 here, or c4 as we talked about. So bishop e6, bishop g2. And now I would expect knight f6, I guess. That would seem to me the most normal. Let's see what the chess engine thinks here. Yeah, knight f6. It's actually thinking about playing h6 very early. But it seems quite extravagant to play a move like h6 in this position. I would think it would be possible to stop knight g5, stop bishop g5. Black playing as if he has all the time in the world. Interesting possibility, though. Okay, so Capablanca played bishop e7, a bit of a strange move order. Now already white could consider taking on c5, this battle for the tempo, you might call it, being more or less won by white. So we can take on c5, black will have to take back with the bishop, and he'll have to waste a move moving the same piece twice. I have no problems with this move whatsoever. I think that that's probably theoretically the most correct move. So anyway, Rubinstein castled, and here I think h6 again is possible. But he played knight f6. Excuse me, rook to c8 was played. Yeah, this is strange. Knight f6 is played in some other games. Horvath Peter, 1991. Hungarian guy, he's a GM now. Doesn't play very often. So knight f6 would be the normal move for black. I don't understand what Capablanca was thinking with rook c8. He wasn't really an opening player, Kappa. He was specialist in technique and general positional play. But I would think knight f6, d takes c5, bishop takes c5. And this is something of a known variation with 30 games here. Korchnoi Spassky, 1977. White should be a little bit better. You could play bishop g5, you can play b3, a3, knight a4, any number of moves. But Capablanca with rook c8 in this position. So it's not clear what this actually does. I mean, it gets the rook off the long diagonal. If you think of the position like it's a Grunfeld or something, I mean, reminds one of black playing like bishop f4 and rook c1 against the Grunfeld. But it's a slow move, and it's not clear the rook on c8 will have any particular immediate relevance in the game. Here, Capablanca took on c5, and this is not the only move. I mean, I would imagine We could play something along the lines of maybe e3, but it looks very passive. So rook c8 does stop b3. You know, there seems to be discouraging ideas along the c file, like b3 will weaken the knight on d4. Maybe discouraging the queenside fianchetto with b3. Kappa takes on c5, and now bishop takes c5. There's already a little bit of interference in the black pieces. Let's say the rook on c8 obstructed by the bishop on c5. And now I think that white has two very reasonable ways of playing. The game continuation with knight to g5, going for that bishop on e6. I think it would also be perfectly acceptable for white to set up a queenside fianchetto. a3, b4 is a bit weakening, but maybe b3, simply b3, with the idea of bishop to b2. Looks to me to be a very solid formation. White has to stand a little better after something like knight f6, bishop to b2, rook c1 coming quickly, and the position looks like a totally normal Tarrasch, where black's played rook c8 a bit too early and spent too tempi on that bishop coming to c5. But Rubinstein goes for something very concrete here, and it's kind of debatable. I think that black's wasted some time, so we can afford this. But this bishop on e6, it's debatable for two reasons. Really, first of all, the bishop is his bad bishop. Black has a pawn on d5, another key pawn on f7. So the white squared bishop is black's bad bishop, and the dark squared bishop is his better bishop, which guards the weak dark squares with pawns primarily on white squares. And you notice the bishop on e6 is what they call like a tall pawn in this position. So it is a bit weird in a sense to go out of your way to exchange off what is essentially a bad bishop. Okay, first of all. Secondly, it's always controversial to do this with white because you may be correcting his pawn structure to some degree. So when we take on e6, we bring the f pawn toward e6. This will defend the pawn on d5. So those pawns on e6 will go from being an isolated pawn to more or less like hanging pawns, which are a little harder for white to put pressure on. But I think that white can get away with knight g5. It's just one way of playing the position, very concrete continuation. Knight f6, and now he takes on e6 right away. F takes e6. And in this position, I think really the first real question about the game, it looks like e4 is quite the logical move, quite strong. Annotators have studied this game to some degree. I think e4 has been debated over the next couple of moves. To me, it's the most natural to play it now, while the bishop on g2 is supporting e4, supporting this advance, and the bishop on g2 in some lines is going to open up. We're going to pry open the entire long diagonal for the bishop on g2. So basically e4, and the variation I analyzed here is for example d4. Now the knight has some interesting paths. We can go to a4, that's my main line. Also possible is knight e2. Knight e2, looking at the maneuver knight to f4. And also, as in some lines of the King's Indian, believe it or not, we can play knight to c1 and knight to d3, where the knight reaches the ultimate blockading square, as in some variations of the Grunfeld and King's Indian. But also interesting is the text variation here, knight a4, that I put in here, and bishop e7, e5. And this is what we're talking about with e4, the bishop on g2, opening up on a long diagonal. I mean, this is what white is really dreaming about when he takes that white squared bishop on e6. And he starts thinking about playing a position with openness and a kind of open situation for the two bishops. This is what we're talking about. So this variation I gave looks good for white. Knight takes e5, bishop takes b7, rook to b8 or c7, hard to call, and the bishop retreats. But when the smoke kind of clears here, if you really take a close look at this position, you see that the black pawns are really, really vulnerable and weak. I mean, the pawn on d4, the pawn on e6, there are tactical chances for white with bishop f4. The bishop on g2 is a really good multi-purpose piece with defensive and offensive possibilities. White has a queenside pawn majority. The d-pawn can be blockaded very handily. And just generally, the white squares look really, really weak for black, particularly e6. is going to be like a long-term weakness. So I think this is a great position for white. He'll probably play something like b3 and bishop b2 and put the bishops on the long diagonals, and it just looks like very good. So that would have been probably the best way for white. But instead, again, being very concrete, Rubinstein decided to play here bishop h3. Now, there are concrete ideas that make this really viable because the rook is on c8. I think if the rook were not on c8, this move would be insufficient for sure. I have seen the idea, you know, in some Grandmaster games in my career, but in general, I think really made possible by rook on c8 here. So bishop h3, queen e7, and now again e4 is very, very interesting. E4, trying to open up the position. Now perhaps black should take on e4 because again d4 doesn't look great. D4, this is an analyzed line in the book by John Donaldson and Nikolai Minev, published by Inside Chess many years ago. This is also probably analyzed as some classic game analysis by various masters who annotated the games from San Sebastian 1911. But it's pretty straightforward, you know, like knight to d5. Black could play something like queen f7 when the knight can go to f4 and then harass e6. The white squares look very weak, so main variation would be like taking it, bishop takes c8, taking on e4, and I looked at this and it just doesn't look great for black. Like bishop g5, castles, queen b3 check, king h8, and queen takes b7, hanging on to all the white's material. White is up the exchange, and black has two powerful looking central pawns, but I don't think that's enough to justify black being down a rook for bishop, you know, at the end of the day. White's king is fairly safe, and it's not really sound for black. So, speculative possibilities there, but objectively, e4 looks good. So I think he should take, and after something like bishop g5, I looked at rook d8, and it looks like black has a playable position. He gets the rook back to a normal square. White still stands a tiny bit better due to the bishop pair, and we'll hopefully get this pawn back on e4, maybe a temporary pawn sacrifice. Bishop takes f6, rook takes d1, and now bishop takes e7, rook takes f1. For example, a torturous sort of endgame where white is just a tiny bit better after rook takes f1, bishop takes e7, or king takes e7, knight takes e4. I mean, this kind of endgame could last many, many moves, but objectively probably should be a draw. So perhaps bishop h3 kind of took the steam out of e4. I don't know. It's not quite as powerful once we've played bishop h3. So Rubinstein plays bishop g5, and with this move he's developing, maybe creating threats of something like e4. Also creating tactics. He's threatening to play knight takes d5 here. So if black is asleep at the switch, play something like h6, for example, double question mark, kablam, knight takes d5, and working with two pins, white wins material here. Now, kind of a cheapo, but I don't think that Rubinstein was playing for cheapos against a player of Capablanca's caliber. Anyway, black should play rook to d8 here, but he was not concerned about the tactics, and he castled instead. Honestly, maybe it's not a mistake because the following position doesn't seem that great for white. Knight takes d5 is not a threat here. We can play knight takes d5 and perhaps transpose. Knight takes d5, e takes d5. This is interesting. Bishop takes f6. Something like g takes f6, queen takes d5 check. We get enough material for the sacrificed rook for black. Bishop takes, rook takes. The end of the day, black has like two pieces for rook and two pawns, which is about equal, a little better for white probably. The two pawns would give white the kind of upper hand. I mean, two pieces for rook and pawn is fair, but two pawns and rook for two pieces looks like it's a little bit better for white. So probably this was white's best chance to play knight takes d5 straight away instead of bishop takes f6 as played in the game. This gives black equality because of one line that's been missed by everyone. Basically, I mean, there may be some chess magazine somewhere that's talked about this that I don't know of, but even the Donaldson book, which isn't that old, misses this line. So knight takes d5, this is the combination, and a lot of analysis has been devoted, but no one's ever really mentioned this possibility of, yes, they mentioned bishop takes f2 check here, this is the game, but what's been missed is bishop takes f2 check, king g2, queen e5. This is the idea that would have equalized for Capablanca. It's hard to see because there's this pin here on the e6 pawn, and I think everybody just misses the following variation, basically. Rook takes f2, rook takes f2, king takes f2, and the point is, I guess you can't play rook f8 because of knight f4, right? So you have to play rook d8, and this is probably the move that everybody missed. The last move in the variation, everything's protected. The rook is protected by the knight on c6. So it's very highly likely that Capablanca and/or Rubinstein, looked at variations of this line, but maybe forgot that black has this move like rook d8 at the end. Just pretty much equalizes. I mean, white's king is a little bit open. He has a bishop in an endgame with pawns on both sides of the board. Probably a slight advantage in itself. But the fact that white's king is a little bit opened up, I think, would give black an equal game here. So both sides missed this continuation. And so white was able to keep an edge. Basically, that would have equalized the game. Instead, Capa played queen h6. And here, after king g2, rook d8, the same idea. But a very highly heralded move, queen c1. This is the move that is considered to be the most brilliant, foresightful move that Rubinstein played in this game. Basically winning a pawn. And he'd like to trade queens, simplifying the position further. Queen takes c1 would only be, in white's favor. So black keeps the queens on. E takes d. Queen takes c5. And we reach like a technical position. This is sort of like a dream position for white against a player of Capablanca's magnitude. It's a Tarrasch. It's a success. He's got the bishop. White's got an extra pawn. And his king is relatively safe. White has 4 pawns to protect the area of the king. So there's an ensuing game here that's very interesting. Queen d2. This is debatable, but I think it's one of the best moves for white. And now queen d5, protecting e2. And safely played knight to d4, queen d3. Not the only move, but I really think that Rubinstein wanted to get the queens off the board here. So black cannot take the pawn on b2 and risk losing a piece. So the following endgame is forced. Queen takes queen and pawn takes. At this point, it's a position where white is just a clear pawn up in 2 rooks and bishop versus 2 rooks and knight. The knight is strong. It's on a very, very powerful outpost. That's the first thing black has going for him. The second thing that black has going for him is that white's extra pawn is on the king's side. It's around his king. It's not that easy for white to just create a passed pawn as if it was like a queenside majority or something like that. So objectively, black has reasonable chances to hang on here with a good knight and difficulty for white to create a passed pawn. So we'll see what happens now. Rook on fe8. White could have played rook on a to e1, but instead played bishop g4. I don't think this is a bad move, improving his bishop, controlling these squares. Bishop g4 back to d1, preventing bishop e2. There's a possibility that this line was overlooked, like basically something like rook a e1, knight c2, and I think at this point it's possible that it wasn't foreseen that white can play the move rook e6 in this position. This may be why Rubinstein actually, not seeing this resource, would explain why he would reject the move rook e1 instead of bishop g4. Because rook e1 is essentially like a little bit more active than playing the move bishop to g4. So that explains that anyway. Bishop g4 though, fine. Rook d6, and now rook e1. Rook takes e1. Black doesn't really want to trade all the pieces off here, but I think one set of pieces is okay. Black doesn't want to play a minor piece endgame, get really close to a king and pawn endgame, a pawn down, something like that, or bishop and knight endgame, a pawn down is probably lost. But getting rid of one set of rooks probably reduce some of white's attacking potential, and I think it's okay for black to exchange the single set of rooks in this position. But here is an interesting moment, because Mises, one of the players who annotated this game, criticized the following move, rook b6. Now, some annotators thought this was very strong. I mean, I'm kind of on the fence about it. I'm not sure. But it also does make a lot of sense to prevent white from getting down on the 7th rank. You have to admit that this does make sense. I mean, maybe, as the computer says here, maybe white would have played bishop f3, just kind of tying black down to that d5 pawn. But rook b6, it's hard to criticize an active move. And now was a key moment in the history of this game, because it gets a little crazy after this, and really b3 should have been considered. I mean, I'm sure it was, but maybe more so than it was, because after b3, rook a6, rook e5, rook takes a2, and now rook takes d5. White has very good chances. I mean, knight takes b3, bishop e6 check, king f8, and rook f5 check wins a piece. This is the main point. This guy's going to fall on b3. So the second point is that if black can't take that, we reach a position that's kind of similar to what happened in the game, but without as much counterplay as actually happened in the game. So it's possible that this was just a better way of doing things for Rubinstein, who's actually one of the greatest endgame players of all time, certainly of his generation. Capablanca, of course. These two, I mean, probably two of the best endgame players in history. Now Capa takes on b2, and there's counterplay on the 7th rank for black. But if he's able to wipe out both the b pawn and the a pawn, as you see in this game, black starts to get some counterplay with the queenside pawns. Rook takes d5, knight c6, a passive move, of course. Bishop e6 check. This is going to guard the a2 guy, or girl, as you prefer. King f8, and now rook f5 check, king e8. King e7 would be better, but it would allow white to later play rook f7 with check, so I'm not sure. Now bishop f7, king d7, king e7 there, also possible, bishop c4, inhibiting b5. And white is up a decisive amount of material here. He's up a clear pawn, he's also threatening to penetrate on the 7th rank with a rook, but black's king is improved. And I think we have a technical position here that's probably winning for white, but very, very much requiring accurate play to execute. So at this point, black played a6. Now, this is debatable. The engine wants to play rook e2 in this position. I was thinking about this. But, I mean, this is going to hinge on, like, allowing a trade of rooks in this position. I mean, the computer engine can't see the horizon that far, depth 22. Do you want to play rook e2, rook f7 check, rook e7, and trade rooks in this minor piece endgame? I was looking at f4 for white, actually. Advancing the kingside majority and making way for the king to come through. I think this probably has to be winning. So I doubt that this is really a good way for black to play. I think Capablanca's play makes more sense. He immobilizes his queenside majority here. It gets very hairy. White wins further material. a6, rook f7 check, king d6, rook takes g7. Now white's up 2 pawns. Of course, it doesn't matter how many white pawns he's up on the king side if black is able to get through a pawn on the queen side. So here we go, b5, and now I think a good move, bishop to g8, where the bishop attacks h7, it stays in touch with the a2 pawn, and generally stays out of the way where it can't be attacked. a5, mobilizing the queen side, and now white takes on h7. Now there's a clear passed pawn for white. This is probably a winning position, but it's hard for the computer to evaluate even the depth of these variations where maybe one side might sacrifice a piece or something. Very hard to calculate for the computer. It has to calculate every single move. Here we have a4, and now h4, b4, and this position, white plays rook h6 check, which to me seems a bit strange. I'm not really sure that I like rook h6 check because we're checking the king up to a more active position, but I don't really think that it's a bad move. It doesn't have any concrete tactical problems. So one problem that white faces is that the rook is in front of his passed pawn. That's not a situation he wants. He'd like to slide the rook over, I would think, behind the passed pawns in this position. So just curious here, what would happen after something like rook to b7? I mean, this move would seem to make a lot of sense. Apparently b3 followed by a3 raises tactical problems. This idea, b3, a takes b, a3, when it's hard to stop the pawn. But black might have to deal with rook b6, rook a6. So I'm curious, but I think that this makes a lot of sense to play rook across to b7. Instead he played rook b6 check, rook h6 check, excuse me, and now black could move the king up or to c7. He plays king c5, and the engine doesn't like this. Maybe king c7 in this position. King c7, and white's probably winning, but it's really again going to require accurate play. He's still blocking the way for his own pawn. So I'm thinking that's why I prefer the rook b7 variation. Rook a6 check, king c5, now rook h5 check. Now in this position, it looks like h5, pushing the pawn one more square. And I analyzed the crazy variation of the rook sacrifice here. This doesn't work because of rook takes a2. For example, bishop takes a2, b3. White's going to have to save themselves with some sort of combinative variations. But I think he can get back in time with rook e6 and rook e1. Okay, so this isn't really possible. b3, for example, I think I did look at a takes b, and now a3. For example, a3, b4 check is always possible, and it just doesn't look like the pawn's getting through. So h5 looks like it's just not enough counterplay for black, but instead he played rook h5 check, and then things get strangely complicated. Rook h5 check, king b6, and here the engine says rook g5. This is a key idea. Annotators suggested here bishop c4, which is probably winning. But the move played in the game makes it very, very messy. He played bishop d5, which actually blocks his own rook from coming across, and allows the following amazing variation. Capablanca lost quickly here with b3, but there's an amazing, amazing line. Rook takes a2 in this position, and this may be close to a draw. In fact, I analyzed the long variation here with the engine that looks like a draw, because if you take on a2, like, you can't stop the pawns. It's an unbelievable variation. White is up a rook, but he cannot actually stop the pawns. And this is not my analysis. This is well-known old analysis. So it looks like white's actually in trouble here after b3. The rook on h5 unable to really help out in any way. It's blocked by its h-pawn, blocked, and all these squares are controlled. He's basically playing two pawns against the bishop and getting through. So white would have to play bishop c4, and this is analysis variation. Rook c2, threatening to take that guy out. Rook b5 check. And in this line, after king c7, there's quite a bit of analysis. Bishop g8, a3, h5, a2, bishop takes a2, rook takes a2, and this is by many analysts considered to be a very key position. But it's interesting that I, with the help of the chess engine, I found another variation that hasn't really been seriously analyzed here. I mean, rook a8 is the main line in analysis, and there is also this strange suggestion, rook a6, which was mentioned in the Donaldson-Minya book, but I mean, it looks like these pawns are really fast, g4, g5. I have some doubts about this. I'm not really sure. But this move looks pretty good. Rook e2, an overlooked resource for black. Rook e2 here, a new idea. And I don't see how white can win this position. There's a funny variation. I analyzed d4, knight takes d4, and rook takes d4, with 3 pawns against the rook and knight. Now, I think that that's usually a draw, but in this case, the h-pawn is so far advanced, it looks kind of dangerous. But with the engine, black defends by 1 tempo, so entertaining position. Knight f5, it's like a forced draw. h7, rook e8, only move. Rook b5, knight e7, maybe only move, I'm not sure. Rook h5, rook h8, and the black king is just in time to come across and basically force a draw. The fact that 3 pawns for white, I mean, rook against rook and knight is a draw, but rook and 3 against rook and knight is still a draw. It's kind of funny. This is analysis variation I just threw out there, but it just doesn't look like there's any way for white to make progress here. This kind of position, it's just not enough to win. Delay g5, and then we just take, and this is just a dead draw. So the final analysis isn't really clear. I mean, in that line where he plays rook takes a2, bishop c4, rook c2, rook b5 check, etc., etc. When we get to this position with h6, maybe these moves would hold. Rook a8 might hold on too. But Capablanca missed his chance. He did not see rook takes a2 was a really viable resource. So Rubinstein got away here with a win where it could have been very, very messy. In the actual game, Capa played b3, and this just loses easily. After a takes b3, a3, bishop takes c6. And the trick is, like, he might have missed this. Maybe Capa missed this fact that you have, like, there's a rook check on b5. There's a really neat trick here. If a2, rook b5 check. And the point that everybody missed probably is that, like, king a6 doesn't work because of rook b8. And the idea is to get behind with rook a8 and stop the queen from behind based on rook a8 and rook a1. So this is very possible that Capa overlooked it, you know, and it's a kind of tactical line. And who knows what the time situation was in the game or whatever. So it was a really, really tough ending. But I thought this was a very important game theoretically in the Tarrasch. Capablanca playing experimentally, not really good. Bishop e6 and rook c8, I think asking too much. But again, he's not an opening specialist. Rubinstein getting the upper hand. Some interesting and original ideas in this analysis, though. We saw bishop takes f2, check with equality based on the idea of queen e5. And a new idea in the endgame, this topical endgame variation with rook e2. This famous endgame, basically. Rook e2 is a possible new idea. Again, in the middle game, the idea that's never really been analyzed that much is bishop takes f2 followed by queen e5 would have equalized for Capablanca. So Rubinstein, although he had a good understanding of the opening, I think he played sort of imprecisely. It would have been better. It would have been better going back to play the immediate e4 instead of bishop h3. Immediate e4, trying to take advantage of the black structure and open up the white squares. This looks like the key idea. And I think in the opening encyclopedias, this is probably given as the best line for white. I'm International Master William Paschall. This was part 2 of taking out the Tarrasch here on Video Chess Training on YouTube. Rubinstein versus Capablanca from San Sebastian, 1911. Thanks for joining me, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Bye-bye.